Hi, my name is Ethan Hansen. I'm doing a Walt Whitman presentation on critical papers written about him and about Leaves of Grass. I'm just going to get right into it because I have a lot to talk about and not that much time. The paper that I did was called Restless Explorations, Whitman's Evolving Spiritual Vision in Leaves of Grass by Ernest Smith. This was published in 2007 in the journal Papers on Languages and Literature, a journal for scholars of language and literature. So he begins by discussing that it's well known that Whitman envisioned Leaves as a new Bible and that he wanted his basic legacy to be writing a religious text. His thesis was to, quote, not to nail down Whitman's religious vision, but, quote, to argue instead that any acknowledgement of the power of Whitman's spiritual message needs to account for the ways in which that message evolves through the expanded editions of Leaves, and how the poetry ultimately emphasizes the unknown over the known. And he quotes that, for Whitman, existing in uncertainty is the vital element of spiritual health, as opposed to certainty of the soul's destination. So, where does Whitman's spiritual vision begin at? He quotes that Whitman did arrive at a unified religious vision while writing Leaves and continued to elaborate that vision through the rest of his life. So he says that he asserts that in Leaves of Grass, Whitman shows a supposed confidence in his spiritual vision. And this confidence is almost overemphasized by scholars who looked at this as Whitman's pull to readers to follow him on his path to enlightenment. But this overshadows the way in which Whitman's spiritual vision becomes more ambiguous as his project grows. So, what is Whitman's spiritual vision? The author starts out with a poem from a later edition of Leaves of Grass, namely Crossing Brooklyn Ferry, which talks about Whitman's view on the eternally possible present. He talks about the ebb and flow of the human soul and its susceptibility to different influences, as well as an emphasis on knowing over possessing the known. This unites reader and poet in mysticism across time and space. So the idea here is basically that Whitman is looking to unite him with his reader and the idea of not knowing what's going on in the universe, which sounds kind of counterintuitive, but he's trying to reduce divisions across class and religion and basically employ this idea of democracy and religion, which is the fact that no human knows exactly what's going on. So after establishing this idea, Whitman goes on and what Smith quotes that Whitman goes on to say in a poem from the original 1855 edition, The Sleepers, to start to question his own spiritual assertions. In this poem, he calls himself wandering and confused, lost to myself, ill-assorted, and contradictory. Looking for, and what the reader can assert is that he's looking for a unification of misery with joy. So a lot of these things are sacred visions about the power of the body, and Whitman will not, in any of his poems, abandon the body for a purely intellectual vision of life the way that some romantic writers will do. Whitman stays tied to the sensual feelings of the body, and he has several experiences with sacred visions of people being killed despite their best efforts against nature, including George Washington watching the deaths of many of his young soldiers at the Battle of Brooklyn and the Revolutionary War. So from this rather depressing viewpoint, Whitman goes on to finish with a humanitarian unity that leaves death as a blank unknown. So next, continuing on that idea, Whitman in later editions will place the Sleepers in between a couple of poems, mostly from drum taps including When Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloomed. These poems deal with death and grief rather than Whitman's original Leaves of Grass assertions from things like when he says, there really is no death, or to die is luckier than anyone has supposed. These poems, such as When Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloomed, engage with the process of death for the living and the realistic nature of grief, as opposed to speculation on what death might mean. One of the important parts of these poems, is that Whitman was working on the front lines of the Civil War, and it seems that he is beginning to come to an understanding that death is a vast blank unknown in human life that is better, but is in an eternal relationship with life that is better intuited than really understood. So I'm running out of time here. One of the last pieces of Whitman's poetry becomes Chanting the Square Deific, which divides religion into 4 basic deities. Some people say that he was part of the deism movement, which notably states that Lucifer is the essential, non-conforming, ever-questioning spirit of American democracy. Okay, other articles I read were called Democracy Self-Reviews in the 1855 edition of Leaves of Grass from the Virginia Quarterly on January 1st, 2005. This talked about how Whitman appealed to working classes and changed the image of the poet in the American public's mind by essentially writing reviews about himself in periodicals and anonymously arguing with critics, and making the poems more about himself than the poetry itself. Another article I read was Whitman's Assumptions in Song of Myself and Leaves of Grass by David Bromwich in Social Research and International Quarterly. And this article talked about the way that Whitman seeks to make the reader an independent entity between the start and the end of Song of Myself. The last article I read was A Spurt of My Own Seminal Wet, a spermatoid design in Walt Whitman's 1860 Leaves of Grass by Ed Folsom in the Huntington Library Quarterly, and this was very pedantic and very interesting. It described how in the 1860 edition, the images on the front of the cover are undeniably spermatoid, and Whitman, as well as several other American intellectuals at the time, had a very interesting ideas developing in their mind about the way that letters and language in books were similar to sexual experience. And basically the way that letters could be referred to as sperm, which create ideas in minds, and Whitman wanted his book to be the sperm that created a new American republic. Great, that's all I had for today. I hope you enjoyed. I hope I didn't go too long. Thank you. Bye.